Let's see how she survives without us. My kids laughed at dinner that night. Their words cut deeper than any blade I'd ever known. I never imagined my own children could be so cruel. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Evelyn Margaret Thompson, and I'm 72 years old. I live in a 3-story brownstone on Prospect Heights in Brooklyn, the same house where I raised 4 children, and where my husband Harold and I built what I thought was a loving family. The morning ritual never changes. I wake at 5:30 before the sun breaks through the heavy curtains, feeling that familiar ache in my joints that reminds me of every year I've lived. The floorboards creak under my slippered feet as I shuffle to the kitchen, my worn terry cloth robe dragging behind me like a security blanket I can't abandon. The kitchen holds the scent of yesterday's coffee and the faint aroma of vanilla candles I light to mask the loneliness. I stand at the counter, staring at the 4 coffee mugs lined up like soldiers, one for each of my children who used to fill this house with noise and laughter. Now those mugs collect dust, monuments to memories that feel more like ghosts than real moments. The photographs covering the refrigerator mock me with their frozen smiles. Birthday parties, graduations, weddings, all the times when we looked like the perfect family everyone envied. That particular evening started like any other family dinner. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing Harold's favorite pot roast, the recipe I'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. The dining room table was set with my grandmother's china. The good plates I only used for special occasions, though lately I'd been using them more often, desperate to make every family gathering feel important. Maybe if I tried harder, maybe if I made everything perfect, they would see me differently. My oldest son Michael arrived first, still in his expensive suit from his job at the investment firm downtown. At 45, he carries himself with the confidence of a man who's never truly struggled, never wondered where his next meal would come from or how he'd pay the rent. His wife Jennifer followed behind, scrolling through her phone, barely acknowledging my greeting. Their teenage daughter Emma slumped into her chair, earbuds firmly planted, creating her own barrier against family interaction. Sarah, my youngest at 38, came through the door complaining about traffic from Manhattan, where she works as a marketing executive. Her husband David nodded politely but immediately started checking his laptop, claiming he had urgent emails to handle. My middle son Robert showed up 20 minutes late, as always, with some excuse about getting held up at his restaurant. The restaurant I helped him buy 5 years ago with a loan of $80,000 that he's never even acknowledged, let alone repaid. And then there was Patricia, my second daughter, 42 and perpetually angry about something. She walked in carrying her designer purse, the one that cost more than some people's monthly salary, the one she bought after asking me for help with her mortgage payment just last month. Harold sat at the head of the table, saying grace in his quiet voice, and for a moment, everything felt normal. The pot roast was tender, the mashed potatoes creamy, the green beans perfectly seasoned. I watched their faces, searching for some sign of appreciation, some recognition of the effort I'd put into making this meal special. Instead, I heard complaints about the weather, discussions about work stress, and endless chatter about their own problems. The conversation shifted when Michael mentioned his latest investment opportunity. "The stock market is really performing well right now," he said, cutting into his meat. "Jennifer and I are thinking about expanding our portfolio, maybe putting some money into cryptocurrency, Bitcoin specifically. The returns could be incredible." "That sounds risky," I offered quietly, remembering Harold's more conservative approach to our investments. Michael laughed, not cruelly yet, but dismissively. "Mom, you don't understand modern investing. This isn't about keeping money in savings accounts anymore. This is about building real wealth." Sarah jumped in. "We're all trying to secure our futures. Some of us don't have the luxury of sitting on a vast fortune like previous generations did." Her tone carried an edge I pretended not to notice. The conversation continued around me, through me, as if I were invisible. They discussed their children's private school tuitions, vacation plans to Europe, home renovations that would cost more than I spent in an entire year. Patricia mentioned needing a new car. Robert talked about expanding his restaurant, and Sarah complained about her apartment rent in Manhattan. That's when the mood shifted. Emma, who had been silent all evening, suddenly pulled out her earbuds and looked directly at me. "Grandma, why are you always so quiet during dinner? Don't you have anything interesting to say?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, waiting for my response. "I just enjoy listening to all of you," I said softly. "I like hearing about your lives." Jennifer, Michael's wife, laughed, a sharp sound that made my stomach clench. "That's sweet, but honestly, Evelyn, sometimes I wonder what you actually do all day. I mean, now that you're retired, do you have any hobbies? Any interests beyond cooking and cleaning?" The words stung, but I maintained my composure. I keep busy. I read, I tend to my garden, I volunteer at the church. Volunteer work doesn't pay the bills, Patricia interrupted. Mom, have you thought about what's going to happen when you can't take care of yourself anymore? When you need help? We all have our own families to worry about. Our own financial responsibilities. Harold cleared his throat. A warning sound I knew well, but the children ignored it. Robert leaned back in his chair, wine glass in hand, and said, Speaking of financial responsibilities, has anyone else noticed how dependent Mom has become on us lately? Always asking for help with technology, always needing someone to explain things to her. That's not true, I protested, but my voice came out smaller than I intended. I just ask for help when I need it. That's what families do. Michael set down his fork and fixed me with a look I'd seen him use during business negotiations. Mom, we need to have a serious conversation about your future, about your finances, about what's going to happen when Dad's not around anymore to take care of everything. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Harold's jaw tightened, and I could see anger building in his eyes. But he remained quiet. He'd always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts before they could explode. Sarah leaned forward, her expression suddenly serious. We've all been talking, and we think it might be time for you to consider selling this house. It's too big for just you and Dad now, and frankly, the maintenance costs must be enormous. You could move into a nice assisted living facility, somewhere with activities and other people your age. We're not ready for assisted living, I said, looking around the table at these people I'd raised, these children I'd sacrificed everything for. This is our home. We raised you here. Your father built that back deck with his own hands. I planted every flower in that garden. Patricia sighed dramatically. Mom, you're being emotional about this. You need to think practically. None of us can afford to support you financially if something happens. We all have mortgages, student loans for our own kids, retirement savings to worry about. The irony of her words hit me like a slap. Support me financially. These children who had come to me countless times over the years, hands outstretched, asking for help with down payments, business loans, emergency funds, medical bills, vacation money, and college tuitions. Robert raised his glass in a mock toast. Here's to Mom finally learning to be independent. Let's see how she survives without us constantly bailing her out. They laughed. All of them laughed. Even Emma giggled behind her hand. The sound echoed off the dining room walls, bouncing between the portraits of ancestors who would have been horrified by this display of disrespect. Harold's face turned red, and he started to stand, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm, stopping him. Let's see how she survives without us, Michael repeated, raising his own glass. Maybe it'll teach her some humility. The laughter continued, but something inside me cracked. Not broke, cracked, like ice beginning to split under pressure. I sat there, surrounded by the people I loved most in the world, and realized I had never felt more alone in my life. After dinner, as they gathered their coats and bags, preparing to return to their own lives and their own problems, I stood in the hallway watching them leave. Each goodbye was perfunctory, a quick peck on the cheek accompanied by promises to call soon that we all knew would never be kept. Michael paused at the door, his expression softening slightly. For a moment, I hoped he might apologize, might acknowledge how hurtful their words had been. Instead, he said, Mom, think about what we discussed tonight. About the house, about your future. You can't live in the past forever. And then they were gone, leaving Harold and me alone with the dirty dishes and the lingering scent of their judgment. I walked slowly back to the dining room, looking at the empty chairs, the scattered napkins, the wine glasses stained with red circles on my grandmother's tablecloth. Evelyn, Harold said quietly, his voice heavy with exhaustion, I'm sorry about tonight. They shouldn't have spoken to you that way. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. We cleaned up in silence, our movements synchronized from decades of practice. As I washed the dishes, warm soapy water running over my hands, I found myself thinking about money, about the vast fortune they had no idea I controlled, about the investments Harold and I had made over the years, the careful planning, the sacrifices we'd made to build something substantial for our children's futures. They wanted to see how I'd survive without them. They had no idea how deeply their cruelty had just changed everything. The story I'm about to tell you began that night, in that moment when their laughter became the sound of my awakening. But to understand what happened next, you need to know the history of everything I'd given them, every sacrifice I'd made, every time I'd chosen their needs over my own dignity. Let me take you back to the beginning, to show you just how much these children had taken from me over the years, and what they never knew they were about to lose. I've been giving to my children since the day they were born, But the financial sacrifices began in earnest when they reached adulthood and started facing the real world. Michael was the first to come asking for help. It was 1995, and he was fresh out of college with a degree in finance but no job prospects that met his standards. He moved back into his childhood bedroom and spent his days sending out resumes and his evenings complaining about how unfair the job market was. "Mom," he said one morning over breakfast, "I need professional clothes for interviews. Good suits, dress shirts, shoes that cost more than $50. You can't make a good impression looking cheap." I remember driving to Brooks Brothers with him, watching him select 3 suits that cost more than Harold made in a month at the post office. $2,000 for clothes, I told myself, was an investment in his future. When he finally got hired at the investment firm, I felt proud. The sacrifice had been worth it, but the request didn't stop. 6 months later, he needed money for a security deposit on an apartment. "I can't live at home forever, Mom. What will my colleagues think?" Another $3,000. Then came the car loan co-signature because his credit wasn't established yet. $8,000 for a used BMW that he claimed was necessary for his professional image. Sarah followed the same pattern, but her requests came with more tears and drama. She was studying marketing at NYU, and every semester brought new financial crises, textbooks, meal plans, study abroad programs, each one presented as absolutely essential for her education and future success. "Mom, everyone in my sorority is going to Italy for spring break," she sobbed into the phone during her junior year. "It's not just a vacation, it's a cultural experience that will help with my international marketing focus. Please, I can't be the only one who doesn't go." $1,500 for a spring break trip that she spent posting pictures on social media of herself drinking wine and shopping in Rome. When I gently suggested that perhaps she could get a part-time job to help with expenses, she accused me of not understanding the demands of her rigorous academic schedule. Patricia's requests were different. Bigger, more sophisticated, wrapped in business language that made them sound less like handouts and more like investments. She'd graduated with an MBA and talked constantly about building wealth, creating passive income, and leveraging opportunities. When she came to me with a proposal to invest in her startup consulting business, she presented spreadsheets and profit projections that made my head spin. "This is a sure thing, Mom," she explained, sitting at my kitchen table with charts spread out between us. "I've identified a gap in the market for small business consulting services. With a $50,000 investment, I can get this company off the ground and be profitable within 18 months. You'd get your money back plus interest. $50,000. I remember staring at the number on the proposal, thinking about how many years Harold would have to work to earn that much money. But Patricia was so confident, so professional in her presentation that it felt wrong to doubt her. "Think of it as an investment in stocks," she continued, "except instead of putting your money into some faceless corporation, you're investing in your own daughter's success. The returns will be much better than anything you'd get from traditional investments." I signed the check, and Patricia's consulting business lasted exactly 11 months before she claimed that market conditions had changed and the business model was no longer viable. My $50,000 had evaporated into office rent, marketing materials, and what she vaguely described as operational expenses. Robert's approach was the most emotional. He'd always been the artistic one, the dreamer, and his requests came wrapped in stories about following his passion and creating something meaningful. When he graduated from culinary school, he had grand plans for opening a restaurant that would serve farm-to-table cuisine with locally sourced ingredients. "This isn't just about making money, Mom," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. "This is about creating something beautiful, something that brings people together around good food and community. I want to build something you and Dad can be proud of." The restaurant required an $80,000 investment, money for equipment, renovation, initial inventory, and operating capital for the first 6 months. Harold and I had to liquidate some of our retirement investments to come up with the funds, but Robert's enthusiasm was infectious. We attended the grand opening, watched him greet customers and explain his menu with genuine passion, and felt like maybe this time was different. For 2 years, the restaurant succeeded. Robert paid us back sporadically, small amounts that barely covered the interest on what we'd had to borrow against our own investments. Then COVID hit, and like many restaurants, his business struggled. Instead of adapting or finding creative solutions, Robert chose to expand, convinced that a second location would solve his cash flow problems. "It's all about scaling up, Mom," he explained during one of his increasingly frequent visits. "One restaurant is vulnerable, but 2 restaurants create synergy. They support each other. I just need another $60,000 to secure the lease and get the second location operational." I hesitated for the first time in decades. Something in my gut told me this was different, that maybe Robert wasn't as careful with money as he claimed to be. But he'd brought his daughter along, my granddaughter, and she looked at me with such hope in her eyes. Grandma, Daddy says if his restaurant becomes really successful, he might be able to pay for my college without taking out student loans. You always said education was important. How could I say no to that? Another $60,000 flowed from our savings to Robert's dream, and within 6 months, both restaurant locations had closed. Robert blamed the economy, blamed changing consumer preferences, blamed everything except his own poor financial management. The pattern continued for years. Michael needed money for his wedding. Just a loan to cover the reception, Mom. Jennifer's parents are paying for everything else, and I can't look cheap in front of them. Sarah needed help with a down payment on her apartment. It's an investment in real estate, Mom. Property values in Manhattan only go up. Patricia needed money to pursue an advanced certification. This will triple my consulting rates, Mom. It'll pay for itself in 6 months. Each request came with justifications, with promises of repayment, with explanations about how this particular expense would solve all their financial problems forever, and each time I said yes. Harold occasionally questioned my generosity, particularly as we got older and our own needs became more pressing, but I always found ways to rationalize my decisions. They're our children, I would tell him when he worried about our dwindling savings. Everything we've worked for is for them anyway. What's the point of having money if we don't use it to help our family? But something started changing in their attitudes toward me as the requests became more frequent and more substantial. The gratitude that used to accompany their asks gradually disappeared, replaced by a sense of entitlement that made my stomach turn. Michael stopped saying please and thank you. Sarah stopped pretending there was any chance of repayment. Patricia started treating me like a business partner rather than her mother, discussing our mutual investments and my portfolio obligations. The breaking point should have come 3 years ago, when I discovered that Patricia had been using my credit to secure additional loans for her business ventures. She'd somehow gotten access to my financial information and had listed me as a co-signer on several business credit cards without my knowledge. When the bills started arriving at my house, totaling over $30,000, I confronted her. Mom, I was going to tell you about this, she said, not even having the decency to look ashamed. It's just paperwork. The business is responsible for all the payments. I just needed someone with better credit to guarantee the accounts. You forged my signature, Patricia. I didn't forge anything. I have power of attorney for your financial affairs, remember? We set that up last year when you were having trouble understanding your investment statements. That power of attorney had been Harold's idea, a precautionary measure in case something happened to either of us, and we needed help managing our finances. I never imagined it would be used as a tool for exploitation by my own daughter. The $30,000 in credit card debt was just the beginning. Over the following months, I discovered other irregularities. Unauthorized withdrawals from accounts Patricia had access to, investments made in my name without my knowledge, even a second mortgage on the brownstone that I didn't remember signing. When I tried to discuss these discoveries with her, Patricia became defensive and turned the conversation back on me. Mom, you're getting older. Your memory isn't what it used to be. You probably approved these things and just forgot. That's exactly why we need to be managing your finances now, to protect you from making mistakes. The gaslighting was subtle but effective. I began to doubt my own memory, to wonder if maybe I was becoming confused about financial matters. Harold tried to reassure me, but he was dealing with his own health issues and didn't have the energy to fight our children's increasingly aggressive financial management of our lives. The final insult came last Christmas, when all 4 children arrived at our house with a unified proposal. They'd been meeting amongst themselves, discussing our finances, planning our future without including us in the conversation. Michael, as the oldest and most financially sophisticated, served as their spokesperson. Mom, Dad, we've been talking and we're worried about your financial security, he began, settling into the living room with his siblings arranged around him like a corporate board. You're getting older, and managing investments and property requires more attention to detail than you might be able to provide. Sarah jumped in with charts and graphs she'd prepared. We've analyzed your assets and identified several areas where your money could be working harder for you. The stock market has been performing incredibly well, but most of your wealth is tied up in this house and in low-yield savings accounts. Patricia, ever the consultant, had prepared a formal presentation. We'd like to propose a comprehensive wealth management strategy that would optimize your returns while protecting your principal. Think of us as your personal investment advisory team. Robert, not to be outdone, added, and we think it makes sense to consolidate everything under a family trust, with us as the trustees. That way, if anything happens to either of you, there won't be any legal complications or tax implications. Your money will be protected and professionally managed. They wanted me to sign over control of everything: the house, the investment accounts, the life insurance policies, even the small business I'd run for years selling handmade quilts at local craft fairs. In exchange, they promised to manage everything responsibly and provide Harold and me with a monthly allowance for our living expenses. It's not about taking control away from you, Michael assured me. It's about protecting your legacy and making sure your money lasts as long as you do. We'll make all the investment decisions, handle all the paperwork, deal with all the complicated financial stuff that you shouldn't have to worry about at your age. I listened to their presentation in stunned silence, watching these 4 people I'd raised and nurtured and sacrificed everything for, as they calmly explained how they planned to take control of my life's work. The brownstone that Harold and I had bought 45 years ago, with money I'd saved from my job as a seamstress. The investments we'd made by living frugally and denying ourselves luxuries so we could build something for our family's future. The small but substantial fortune we'd accumulated through decades of careful planning and hard work. They wanted it all. And they wanted me to hand it over willingly, with gratitude for their generous offer to manage my financial affairs. We need some time to think about this, Harold said quietly, speaking for the first time since their presentation began. Patricia's smile tightened. Of course, but don't take too long. The longer we wait to optimize your investment strategy, the more money you're losing to inefficiency. Michael nodded in agreement. And honestly, some of the financial decisions you've been making lately have us concerned, like that $20,000 donation to the church building fund last year. That money could have been invested in cryptocurrency and probably doubled by now. Or the money you spent renovating the guest bathroom, Sarah added. Was that really necessary? You could have put that $10,000 into Bitcoin and earned significant returns. They left that day with promises to return the following week for our answer, and I spent 7 sleepless nights thinking about their proposal. Part of me was tempted to accept it. Financial management had become more complicated as I'd gotten older, and the idea of not having to worry about investment decisions or tax implications was appealing. But something deep in my gut rebelled against the idea of becoming financially dependent on my own children, especially given their track record of treating my money as their personal ATM. Every time they'd borrowed money from me over the years, they'd promised it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet. None of those loans had ever been repaid, not even partially. When they returned the following week, I told them we needed more time to consider their proposal. Their reactions revealed more than any financial presentation ever could. Michael became irritated, tapping his fingers impatiently on the coffee table. Sarah's voice took on a sharp edge as she pointed out all the ways I was being financially irresponsible by delaying. Patricia threatened to withdraw her consulting services if I didn't appreciate her professional expertise. But it was Robert who revealed the truth behind their concern for my financial welfare. Mom, you're being selfish. This isn't just about you and Dad anymore. We all have families to think about, kids to put through college, mortgages to pay. The money you're sitting on could be helping all of us build better lives. But instead, you're hoarding it like some kind of miser. Hoarding it. After a lifetime of giving them everything they asked for, I was now accused of hoarding my own money. That night, after they'd left in various states of frustration and disappointment, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the word hoard. Dragons hoard treasure in fairy tales, keeping it locked away from anyone who might benefit from it. Misers hoard money, counting it obsessively while denying themselves and others any pleasure or comfort it might provide. Was that what I was doing? Was I being selfish by wanting to maintain control over my own finances? Or was I finally beginning to understand what my children really thought of me, not as their mother, not as a person deserving of respect and dignity, but as a resource to be managed and ultimately exploited? The realization that followed was perhaps the most painful of my entire life. My children didn't love me. They loved what I could give them. They didn't respect me. They tolerated me as long as I remained useful. They didn't want to protect me. They wanted to protect their inheritance. And that realization led to another, even more devastating truth. I had taught them to see me this way. Through decades of saying yes to every request, of prioritizing their needs over my own dignity, of buying their affection with loans that became gifts, I had trained my own children to view me as nothing more than a bank account with emotions. But here's what they never knew, what they never bothered to ask about, what their assumptions about my simple old-fashioned approach to money management had blinded them to. Harold and I weren't just financially comfortable. We were wealthy, very wealthy. The brownstone in Brooklyn that they saw as my primary asset, it was just one of 7 properties I owned across New York. The low-yield savings accounts they'd mocked in their presentation, those were actually money market accounts that were part of a sophisticated investment strategy I'd been implementing for over 20 years. You see, While my children were busy with their own careers and their own financial struggles, I'd been quietly building a business empire. What started as a small quilting hobby had grown into a textile import company that supplied fabrics to manufacturers across the Northeast. The craft fairs where I sold my handmade quilts were actually trade shows, where I networked with international suppliers and negotiated contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Harold knew about the business, of course, but we'd agreed early on to keep the full extent of our wealth private. We'd seen too many families destroyed by money, too many children who became entitled and lazy when they knew their parents were wealthy. We wanted our children to learn the value of hard work, to build their own successes before they inherited ours. But somewhere along the way, our plan had backfired. Instead of teaching them self-reliance, our secrecy had allowed them to see us as financial resources rather than as people. Instead of respecting our work ethic, they developed the assumption that our money was somehow rightfully theirs. The stock portfolio alone was worth over $2 million, carefully diversified across technology companies, real estate investment trusts, and yes, even some cryptocurrency investments that had performed better than Michael's most optimistic projections. The business generated consistent profits that I'd been reinvesting for years, building wealth that would have shocked my children if they'd bothered to look beyond their assumptions about their simple, old-fashioned mother. But they never asked about my business. They never inquired about my investments. They never wondered how two people on modest incomes had managed to accumulate enough money to fund their countless requests for financial help over the years. They simply assumed I was slowly depleting my savings to support their lifestyles, never realizing that their periodic withdrawals barely made a dent in assets that continued to grow year after year. And now they wanted to manage my finances for my own protection. The irony was breathtaking, but it was about to become much more painful. Because their casual cruelty at that dinner, their laughter at the idea of me surviving without them, was about to teach all of us exactly how much they needed me, and how easily I could survive without them. But first, I had to survive the discovery that would shatter whatever remained of my faith in my children's love. 3 weeks after that horrible dinner, I was organizing papers in Harold's desk when I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a folder marked estate planning, and inside were documents I'd never seen before. Documents that revealed the full extent of my children's assumption about our financial situation and their plans for our future. There were emails between Michael and Patricia discussing the burden of eventually having to support Harold and me financially. Sarah had written a detailed analysis of what it would cost to move us into appropriate senior housing and how the family could split those expenses. Robert had researched the potential sale value of our brownstone and calculated how much each sibling would inherit after estate taxes and funeral expenses. But the most devastating document was a letter Patricia had drafted to send to an elder care attorney, inquiring about the legal process for having someone declared mentally incompetent if they refused to accept necessary financial management assistance. They were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't voluntarily sign over control of my finances. I sat in Harold's study, surrounded by 45 years of memories, holding evidence that my own children viewed me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a mother to be loved. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the window seemed to mock the darkness that had settled in my chest. That evening, when Harold came home from his doctor's appointment, I showed him what I'd found. I watched the color drain from his face as he read through the emails and documents, saw his hands shake as the full implications of our children's plans became clear. "How did it come to this, Evelyn?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How did we raise children who could think of us this way?" I didn't have an answer then, and I don't have a complete answer now. But I was beginning to understand that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's enablement. Generosity without reciprocity isn't kindness. It's exploitation. And family loyalty that only flows in one direction isn't really family at all. The next morning, I called the attorney who had helped Harold and me set up our wills and trust documents years earlier. James Morrison had been our lawyer for over a decade, and he knew the full extent of our financial situation. When I explained what was happening with our children and showed him the documents I'd found, his reaction was immediate and strong. "Evelyn, this is elder abuse," he said bluntly. "What they're planning, what they've already done with accessing your credit and financial accounts, this is illegal. We need to take immediate steps to protect your assets and your legal rights." Within a week, James had helped me change all the passwords on my financial accounts, revoke the power of attorney I'd given Patricia, and set up new investment accounts that my children couldn't access. He also recommended a forensic accountant who could trace all the unauthorized transactions Patricia had made using my credit and financial information. The full extent of the financial abuse was staggering. Over the course of 3 years, Patricia had used her access to my accounts to borrow over $150,000. money that had supposedly gone to investment opportunities that never materialized. Michael had been receiving monthly payments from one of my business accounts, payments he'd told me were temporary help with his mortgage, but that had been going on for over 2 years. Sarah had been using a credit card linked to my accounts to pay for everything from groceries to vacations, while Robert had somehow arranged for his restaurant's utility bills and insurance payments to be automatically deducted from my business account. They hadn't just been borrowing money from me occasionally. They'd been systematically draining my accounts while convinced that I was too old and too simple to notice what was happening. The betrayal cut deeper than any pain I'd ever experienced. These weren't desperate children asking their mother for help in times of crisis. These were middle-aged adults who had decided that my money was their money and that my consent was optional. But James Morrison had another revelation that would prove to be the key to everything that happened next. "Evelyn," he said during one of our meetings, "I don't think your children have any idea about the full extent of your wealth. Based on their communications and their behavior, they seem to think you have a comfortable retirement nest egg that they're slowly depleting. They don't realize that everything they've taken from you represents less than 5% of your actual assets." He was right. My children thought they were draining my savings when they were actually just skimming from the overflow. They thought they were taking my security when they were barely touching my principal. They thought they were smart and sophisticated investors when they were actually just petty thieves stealing from someone they assumed was financially vulnerable. That's when I realized that their cruelty at dinner, their laughter about my inability to survive without them, wasn't just ignorant. It was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who held the power in our family's financial relationship. They thought I needed them. They had no idea how desperately they needed me, and I was about to show them the difference. The first step was subtle. I simply stopped responding to their financial requests with automatic agreement. When Michael called asking for help with his son's private school tuition, I told him I needed time to think about it. When Sarah emailed asking for help with her apartment security deposit for a larger place, I said we'd discuss it later. The requests had become so routine that they barely waited for my response before assuming I'd say yes. Now, suddenly, they had to wait. They had to ask twice, 3 times. They had to explain and justify and even occasionally say please. Their confusion was immediate and obvious. Michael called Harold to ask if I was feeling well, if maybe I was experiencing some kind of cognitive decline that was making me less decisive about financial matters. Patricia scheduled a lunch meeting with me to discuss what she called my recent hesitancy around investment opportunities. But I wasn't hesitant. I was awakening. Every day that passed after finding those documents in Harold's desk, I felt a little bit stronger, a little bit clearer about what had been happening to our family dynamics over the years. The children had trained me to be their financial resource just as surely as I had trained them to see me that way. They'd learned that persistence paid off, that emotional manipulation worked, that if they just kept asking and kept explaining how important their requests were, I would eventually capitulate. But now the dynamic was changing, and they didn't know how to handle it. The first real confrontation came 6 weeks later at what was supposed to be a pleasant family barbecue in our backyard. Harold had spent the afternoon grilling hamburgers and corn on the cob, and I'd made potato salad and lemonade. The grandchildren were playing on the swing set Harold had built 20 years earlier, and for a moment, everything felt normal and happy. Then Patricia pulled me aside for what she called a private conversation. "Mom, I'm worried about you," she began, using the concerned tone she'd perfected for manipulating clients in her consulting business. "You've been acting differently lately, and frankly, some of your recent financial decisions have me concerned." "What financial decisions?" I asked, genuinely curious to hear her perspective. "Well, for one thing, you've been delaying responses to perfectly reasonable requests for help. Michael told me you made him wait 2 weeks before agreeing to help with Tommy's tuition, and even then you only offered half of what he asked for." I had indeed offered to pay half of my grandson's private school tuition, thinking that Michael and Jennifer could certainly afford to pay the other half themselves given their combined income of over $200,000 per year. "And Sarah said you've been asking a lot of questions about her apartment situation," Patricia continued. "Questions about her lease terms and her roommate arrangements and whether she's looked into more affordable options. She feels like you don't trust her judgment anymore." Actually, I'd been asking questions because I'd discovered that Sarah was paying rent for an apartment that was twice as large and twice as expensive as anything she needed, while simultaneously claiming she couldn't afford basic living expenses without my help. "Mom, I think you might be developing some age-related anxiety around money," Patricia said, her voice taking on the professional tone she used when delivering bad news to clients. "It's very common for elderly people to become paranoid about their finances, to start seeing threats where none exist." "What kind of threats?" I asked. Well, like thinking that your own family is somehow taking advantage of you financially, or starting to question perfectly reasonable requests for help that you've always been happy to provide. The gaslighting was so blatant, so professionally executed, that I almost admired Patricia's skill, even as I recognized what she was doing to me. "I've been thinking about our conversation from Christmas," I said carefully, "about the estate planning and financial management proposal you all presented." Patricia's eyes lit up with hope. "Oh, good. Have you and Dad had a chance to discuss it? I really think you'll find that consolidating your financial management under our oversight will reduce your stress and improve your returns. Actually, I've been wondering about something. When you prepared that presentation, what information did you use to analyze our financial situation?" "Well, I looked at your bank statements, your investment account summaries, the property tax records for the house. Michael helped me estimate the value of Dad's pension and Social Security benefits." "And that's all the financial information you think Harold and I have?" Patricia looked confused. "What else would there be? I mean, you've always lived modestly, and we know that helping us over the years has been a stretch for your budget. That's exactly why we want to help you manage everything more efficiently going forward." It was remarkable. My daughter, who fancied herself a sophisticated financial consultant, had analyzed my wealth based entirely on the most obvious and accessible accounts. She'd never asked about my business income, never inquired about additional investment accounts, never wondered how Harold and I had managed to provide hundreds of thousands of dollars in financial help over the years while maintaining our own comfortable lifestyle. She'd simply assumed that we were slowly bankrupting ourselves to fund their requests, and that assumption had formed the basis of all her calculations and recommendations. "Patricia," I said slowly, "what would you say if I told you that the accounts you analyzed represent less than 20% of our actual assets?" She laughed, the same dismissive sound I'd heard at that horrible dinner. "Mom, that's exactly the kind of confused thinking I'm worried about. You're starting to imagine that you have resources you don't actually have. That's why we need professional financial management now, before these delusions cause you to make truly damaging decisions." A professional financial management, delusions, age-related anxiety. I looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised and educated and supported through every challenge of her adult life, and realized that she wasn't just stealing from me, she was convincing herself that the theft was actually a form of caregiving. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. "Patricia," I said, "I think it's time for you and your brothers and sister to understand exactly who you've been talking to." I excused myself from the barbecue and went into the house, returning with a folder of documents that I'd prepared with James Morrison's help. Financial statements, business records, investment portfolios, property deeds, everything that revealed the true extent of the wealth Harold and I had built over 45 years of marriage. I set the folder on the picnic table and called the rest of the children over. Harold joined us, understanding without words that this was the moment we'd both known was coming. "I want to show you something," I said, opening the folder and spreading the documents across the table. "I want you to see what you've really been dealing with all these years when you've come to me asking for financial help." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the grandchildren stopped playing and turned to look at the adults staring in shock at the papers in front of them. Michael picked up a bank statement showing the balance in one of my investment accounts, $847,000. Sarah found a property deed for a rental property in Manhattan that generated $8,000 per month in income. Robert discovered business tax returns showing annual profits of over $300,000 from my textile company. Patricia, the financial consultant who thought she understood money management, stared at a portfolio summary showing a total asset value of over $4.2 million. "This can't be right," she whispered. "Mom, where did all this money come from?" "From working," I said simply. "From saving. From investing. From building a business while you were all busy building your own lives. From 45 years of making careful financial decisions and living below our means so that we could help our children when they needed it." Michael looked up from the documents with an expression I'd never seen before, something between awe and calculation. "You mean all these years, when we've been asking for help, you could have given us much more?" "That's not the point," Harold said quietly, speaking for the first time since the documents had been revealed. But Michael wasn't listening to his father. "Do you realize how much easier our lives could have been if we'd known about this money? The stress we've been under, trying to manage mortgages and college tuitions and business expenses, the opportunities we've missed because we didn't have enough capital?" Sarah nodded in agreement. "Mom, why didn't you tell us? We could have made so many different decisions if we'd known you had this kind of money available." Robert was already calculating. "The restaurant could have succeeded if I'd had access to proper investment capital from the beginning. Instead of trying to bootstrap everything, I could have opened with sufficient reserves to weather the slow periods." And Patricia, ever the consultant, was already formulating plans. This changes everything about our estate planning strategy. We need to restructure the trust arrangements, optimize the tax implications, maybe look into some offshore investment opportunities. They were missing the point entirely. The revelation of our wealth hadn't humbled them, or made them grateful for what we'd provided over the years. Instead, it had excited them about what they could have had and what they might still be able to get. "You're all missing the most important thing," I said, gathering the documents back into the folder. "The point isn't how much money we have. The point is how you've been treating the people who've been supporting you all these years." But I could see in their faces that they weren't ready to hear that lesson. The shock of discovering our wealth had overwhelmed any capacity for self-reflection about their behavior. They were too busy recalculating their expectations and their strategies to consider whether their approach to our relationship might need to change. That's when I realized that showing them the money had been a mistake. Instead of teaching them humility, it had only increased their sense of entitlement. Instead of helping them understand the sacrifices Harold and I had made for their benefit, it had only convinced them that we should have been making greater sacrifices all along. The barbecue ended with confused conversations and half-hearted promises to discuss this more later. The children left with their heads spinning, not from shame or gratitude, but from excitement about revised financial expectations and inheritance projections. That night, Harold and I sat on our back porch watching the sun set over Brooklyn, both of us understanding that we'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The secret we'd kept for decades was now exposed, and the consequences were already becoming clear. "I think we made things worse," Harold said quietly. He was right. By revealing our wealth, we'd accidentally confirmed our children's belief that we existed primarily as their financial resource. Now they knew the resource was much larger than they'd imagined, but their fundamental attitude toward us hadn't changed. It had intensified. The phone call started the next day. Michael called first, suggesting we meet with his financial advisor to optimize our investment strategy and make sure our wealth is working as hard as possible for the whole family. Sarah called with ideas for family investment opportunities, including a vacation property in the Hamptons that would benefit everyone, while also serving as a tax write-off. Robert wanted to discuss reopening his restaurant with proper capitalization this time, and Patricia had prepared a comprehensive wealth management proposal that would put all our assets under professional management, meaning her management, of course. Each conversation was courteous and loving on the surface, filled with concern for our well-being and excitement about family financial planning. But underneath the polite language, the message was clear. Now that they knew how much money we had, they expected access to much more of it. The subtle financial abuse that had been happening for years was about to become aggressive and systematic. They weren't just going to ask for help anymore. They were going to demand their fair share of what they now saw as the family fortune. And that's when I realized that their cruel laughter at that dinner hadn't been the end of my humiliation. It had been the beginning of their most brazen attempt to take control of everything Harold and I had worked to build. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that revealing their contempt for me would be consequence-free, that I would continue to absorb their disrespect while funding their lifestyles indefinitely. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. The morning after that barbecue, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The fog of confusion and self-doubt that had clouded my judgment for so long was gone, replaced by a steel-hard determination that surprised even me. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen while Harold still slept, and I sat at the table where I'd signed so many checks over the years, where I'd listened to so many sob stories and urgent requests and elaborate justifications for why my money needed to become their money. But this morning, I wasn't thinking about their needs or their problems or their dreams. I was thinking about mine. For the first time in decades, I was putting myself first. I called James Morrison at 8 o'clock sharp, before his secretary had even arrived at the office. "James," I said when he picked up his direct line, "I need to make some changes to our financial arrangements. Significant changes." "What kind of changes, Evelyn?" "I want to cut off all financial support to our children, effective immediately, and I want to make sure they can't access any of our accounts or influence any of our financial decisions going forward." There was a pause before James responded. "That's a pretty dramatic step. Are you sure you want to move that quickly?" "I'm sure. Yesterday, they proved to me that they see our money as their inheritance to be managed rather than our assets to be controlled. I'm done funding that attitude." "All right. I can draft new account agreements and security protocols by the end of the week. Do you want to notify them yourself, or should I handle the communications?" I thought about it for a moment, imagining the phone calls and emails and emotional manipulation that would follow. "I'll tell them myself, but I want all the legal protections in place first." "Understood. And Evelyn, this is the right decision. From what you've told me about their behavior, this is long overdue. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of legal paperwork and financial restructuring. James introduced me to a wealth management firm that specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial abuse, even when that abuse came from family members. Together, we created an ironclad system that would prevent my children from accessing my accounts, using my credit, or making any financial decisions on my behalf. I also made some proactive decisions that felt incredibly liberating. I increased my charitable giving to organizations that actually appreciated my contributions. I booked a 2-week cruise to Alaska that Harold and I had been talking about for years, but never took because we were always helping someone else with their financial crises. And I hired a forensic accountant to calculate exactly how much money my children had taken from me over the years, both the amounts I'd given willingly and the amounts they'd helped themselves to without permission. The total was staggering: over $680,000 in direct financial support over the past 15 years, plus another $200,000 in unauthorized transactions and credit abuse. Nearly $1 million that had flowed from my accounts to theirs, with barely a thank you note in return. But here's what really shocked me: that $880,000 represented less than 3 years of my business income. While my children had been congratulating themselves on their sophisticated exploitation of their elderly mother's resources, they'd actually been taking less than 15% of my annual earnings. They thought they were draining me dry when they were actually just skimming from the overflow. On Thursday evening, I called each of them and asked them to come to dinner on Sunday. "There are some things Harold and I need to discuss with all of you," I said. "Some decisions we've made about our financial situation going forward." The eagerness in their voices was unmistakable. They thought this was going to be the conversation where we announced our new, more generous approach to family financial support. They thought revealing our wealth had finally convinced us to share it more freely with our deserving children. Patricia even asked if she should bring her financial planning materials. "I've been working on some ideas for maximizing the family's overall returns," she said. "I think you'll be really excited about what I've put together." Sunday dinner was a repeat of the previous week's barbecue, but with an atmosphere of anticipation instead of shock. The children arrived early and stayed late, making small talk while clearly waiting for the financial discussion I'd promised. Finally, after the dishes were cleared and the grandchildren were playing in the yard, I asked everyone to join Harold and me in the living room. 3 weeks ago, I began, "You all learned something about our financial situation that surprised you. You discovered that we have significantly more money than you'd realized." Nods and smiles around the room. They thought this was leading to good news about increased financial support. Since then, each of you has contacted us with ideas about how we should manage our money differently, how we should invest it, how we should structure our estate planning, and how we should support the family financially going forward. More nods. They were expecting me to announce that I'd accepted one or more of their proposals. "I've given all of your suggestions careful consideration, and I've made some decisions." The room was absolutely silent, everyone waiting for my announcement. Effective immediately, Harold and I are ending all financial support to our children. The silence deepened, but I could see confusion beginning to replace anticipation on their faces. That means no more loans, no more gifts, no more help with mortgages or tuition or business expenses or emergency situations. You are all adults with your own careers and your own resources. It's time for you to manage your own financial lives without depending on us. Patricia was the first to speak. "Mom, I don't understand. Are you saying you're cutting us off financially as some kind of punishment?" "I'm saying that I'm tired of being treated like a bank rather than like your mother. I'm tired of the assumption that our money is somehow your money. I'm tired of being disrespected and taken advantage of by the people I love most." Michael leaned forward with the expression he used when negotiating business deals. "Mom, I think there's been some misunderstanding here. Nobody's been disrespectful or taken advantage of anyone. We're family. Families help each other. Families respect each other too," Harold said quietly. "And respect has been in short supply around here lately." Sarah's voice took on the wheedling tone she'd used as a child when she wanted something. "Mom, if this is about what we said at dinner a few weeks ago, we were just teasing. You know we didn't mean anything by it. Let's see how she survives without us," I quoted back to her. "That's what you said while laughing about my financial dependence on you. Except you had it backwards, didn't you? The question isn't how I'll survive without you. The question is how you'll survive without me." Robert tried a different approach. "Look, if we've hurt your feelings somehow, we're sorry. But cutting off all financial support seems like an extreme overreaction. Can't we just talk about this like adults?" "We are talking about it like adults," I replied. "For the first time in years, actually. Adults don't expect their elderly parents to fund their lifestyles indefinitely. Adults don't use their parents' credit cards without permission. Adults don't forge signatures on financial documents. Adults don't steal money from their parents' accounts and then claim it was just a misunderstanding. The accusations hung in the air like smoke. I watched as each of them realized that I knew about their unauthorized access to my finances, their systematic exploitation of my generosity, their carefully planned strategy to gain control of my assets. Patricia recovered first, shifting immediately into damage control mode. Mom, if there have been some irregularities with account access, I'm sure we can work out any misunderstandings. I never did anything without what I believed was your implicit consent. Implicit consent, I repeated. Is that what you call forging my signature on loan documents? Implicit consent? Michael tried to take charge of the conversation. Okay, clearly there are some issues we need to work through as a family, but cutting off all financial support isn't going to solve anything. If anything, it's just going to create more problems and more resentment. Michael, I said, looking directly at my oldest son, last year alone, you received $43,000 in direct financial support from us. Sarah received $38,000. Patricia received $67,000, not counting the unauthorized credit card charges. Robert received $51,000. In total, you four adults took nearly $200,000 from us in 1 year, and not one of you has ever paid back a penny, or even acknowledged that these were loans rather than gifts. The specific numbers seemed to shock them more than the general accusations had, perhaps because they'd never calculated the totals themselves, never realized how much they'd been taking collectively. Now, I continued, I want each of you to think honestly about how much financial support you've provided to Harold and me over the years. How much money have you given us? How many of our bills have you paid? How many times have you helped us with emergency expenses or major purchases? The answer, of course, was 0. In 45 years of marriage, Harold and I had never asked any of our children for financial help, never depended on them for anything beyond their presence and their love. The relationship had been entirely one way. Financially speaking, we gave, they took. We sacrificed, they benefited. We saved and invested and built wealth. They spent and borrowed and expected more. But Mom, Sarah said, her voice taking on a desperate edge, you've always said that you wanted to help us. You've always said that's what parents do for their children. And I've always meant it, I replied. But helping children and enabling adults are two different things. I helped you when you were struggling to get established, when you faced genuine emergencies, when you were building your careers and your families. But somewhere along the way, my help became your expectation. My generosity became your entitlement. Robert made one last attempt at manipulation. So you're saying that decades of family closeness, of mutual support, of love and connection, all of that means nothing to you now? Robert, I said, when was the last time you called me just to ask how I was doing? When was the last time any of you visited without needing something? When was the last time you showed interest in my life, my business, my thoughts, my feelings, without it being connected to some financial request? The silence that followed was devastating, not because they couldn't answer the questions, but because we all knew what their answers would be. This conversation is over, I announced, standing up from my chair. You all know where Harold and I live, and you all have our phone numbers. When you're ready to have a relationship with us that's based on love and respect rather than on financial exploitation, we'll be here. Until then, we're going to focus on enjoying the money we've worked so hard to earn. They left that evening in various states of anger, confusion, and disbelief. I heard car doors slamming, voices raised in passionate discussion in our driveway, the sound of cell phones ringing as they immediately began calling each other to strategize their response. But for the first time in years, Harold and I were left alone in our house without the weight of someone else's financial crisis pressing down on us. We sat on our back porch with glasses of wine, watching the sunset over Brooklyn, and talked about all the places we wanted to travel and all the things we wanted to do with our time and our money now that we were no longer funding our children's lifestyles. It felt like being young again, like being newlyweds planning our future together, instead of elderly parents managing our children's endless needs. The phone started ringing the next morning and didn't stop for 3 weeks. Michael called first, claiming he wanted to apologize for any misunderstandings, but actually trying to negotiate a compromise that would restore at least some financial support. When that didn't work, he tried guilt. His children's college funds, his mortgage payments, his wife's medical expenses that insurance didn't cover. Sarah alternated between tears and anger, sometimes within the same phone call. She accused me of destroying the family, of being selfish and vindictive, of punishing her children for her mistakes. When emotional manipulation failed, she tried practical arguments about family financial planning and generational wealth management. Patricia took a professional approach, presenting detailed arguments about why my decision was financially irresponsible and legally problematic. She threatened to challenge my mental competency if I didn't restore her access to family financial accounts. When I reminded her that I'd already consulted with attorneys who were well aware of my mental acuity, she backed down but continued calling with new strategies and proposals. Robert was the most persistent and the most creative in his approaches. He tried everything from sending flowers with apology notes to showing up at my door with his children, hoping that seeing my grandchildren would weaken my resolve. But the most revealing response came from Jennifer, Michael's wife, who called me after the second week of my financial boycott. "Evelyn," she said, "I want you to know that I support what you're doing. Michael has never told me how much money you've given us over the years, but I've seen the checks and I've heard the conversations. You've been incredibly generous, and we've never properly thanked you or acknowledged what a sacrifice it must have been." Jennifer's call was the first genuine expression of gratitude I'd received from anyone in my family in years. It was also a revelation about how my own son had been hiding the extent of my financial support from his wife, taking credit for college tuitions and home improvements that I'd actually funded. "Michael is furious with me for calling you," Jennifer continued. "He says it's a family matter and I shouldn't interfere. But I wanted you to know that if you change your mind about helping us financially in the future, it won't be because we feel entitled to it. It'll be because we appreciate it and because we understand that it's a gift, not an obligation." Jennifer's honesty was like water in a desert. It reminded me that not everyone in my family had lost sight of basic decency and gratitude. It also confirmed that my decision to cut off financial support was already forcing my children to have conversations with their own families about money, responsibility, and appreciation that were long overdue. But the most dramatic response came from Patricia, who showed up at our house 3 weeks after the financial cutoff with a folder full of legal documents and threats. "Mom," she said, settling into the living room chair like she was conducting a business meeting, "I've consulted with several attorneys about your recent decisions, and I want you to understand the legal implications of what you're doing." "What legal implications?" I asked calmly. "Well, for one thing, there are tax consequences to suddenly stopping the financial support you've been providing. The IRS could interpret your previous gifts as part of a systematic wealth transfer plan, and discontinuing that plan could trigger audit questions." This was complete nonsense, as Patricia well knew, but she was betting that I wouldn't understand tax law well enough to call her bluff. "For another thing," she continued, "there are estate planning implications. If you're planning to disinherit us or significantly reduce our inheritance, there are legal procedures that have to be followed. You can't just make arbitrary decisions about generational wealth transfer without proper legal oversight." More nonsense. Harold and I were free to leave our money to anyone we chose, or to spend it all on ourselves before we died, without anyone's permission or oversight. But Patricia's most outrageous claim was yet to come. "Most importantly, Mom, I've been researching elder financial abuse, and what you're doing could actually be considered self-abuse. Preventing your own family from managing your finances when you're clearly struggling with age-related decision-making issues is a form of financial self-harm that could require intervention." "Intervention from whom?" I asked. "From Adult Protective Services, from the courts, from family members who have a legal responsibility to protect elderly relatives from their own poor judgment." She was threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent and have my assets placed under court supervision, with her as the most likely appointed guardian, of course. "Patricia," I said, standing up from my chair, "I want you to leave my house now." "Mom, I'm trying to help you understand." "I understand perfectly. You're threatening to use the legal system to steal my money because I won't give it to you voluntarily. You're threatening to have me declared mentally incompetent because I'm competent enough to see through your manipulation. That's not what I'm saying. That's exactly what you're saying. And it's exactly the kind of abusive behavior that confirmed I made the right decision about cutting off your financial support." Patricia gathered her papers and left, but not before delivering one final threat. "This isn't over, Mom. You can't treat your family this way and expect there to be no consequences." That night, Harold and I discussed something we'd never seriously considered before. What we would do if our children actually followed through on their threats to challenge our mental competency or contest our financial decisions in court. "They can try," Harold said grimly, "but James Morrison has documented everything. He has records of all their unauthorized access to your accounts, all their financial abuse, all their attempts to manipulate you into signing over control of our assets. If they want to go to court, They're going to find out that the legal system doesn't look kindly on adult children who steal from their elderly parents and then claim the parents are incompetent for trying to stop the theft. He was right. But the conversation forced us to confront an uncomfortable reality. Our children were now our adversaries rather than our family. They were actively strategizing against us, looking for ways to override our decisions and gain control of our money by any means necessary. The people we'd raised and loved and sacrificed for were now treating us as obstacles to be overcome rather than parents to be respected. But they were about to discover that their elderly mother was much more formidable than they'd realized. 2 months after I cut off their financial support, I received a letter from Michael that changed everything. It wasn't addressed to me personally. It was addressed to the estate of Evelyn and Harold Thompson, as if we were already dead. Inside was a formal legal document titled Petition for Financial Guardianship of Incapacitated Adults. Michael, Patricia, and Sarah had all signed it. Robert had apparently refused to participate, but the other 3 were formally requesting that the court declare Harold and me mentally incompetent and appoint them as our financial guardians. The document was filled with lies that took my breath away. It claimed that we were showing signs of dementia and confusion. It alleged that we were making irrational financial decisions that endangered our own security. It suggested that we were vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous individuals who might take advantage of our diminished mental capacity. The irony was breathtaking. The same children who had been exploiting us financially for years were now claiming they needed to protect us from financial exploitation. But the most devastating part of the document was the section titled Evidence of Mental Incapacity. They had listed every time I'd asked questions about their requests for money as evidence of confusion. Every time I'd delayed making a decision about financial support as proof of indecisiveness. Every time I'd asked for documentation or justification as signs of paranoia and mistrust. They were using my newfound prudence and caution as evidence that I was losing my mental faculties. I called James Morrison immediately, and he was furious when he read the petition. "This is exactly the kind of retaliatory legal action we prepared for," he said. "They're filing a frivolous claim that's going to backfire spectacularly when all the evidence of their financial abuse comes to light during the court proceedings." "Will we have to go to court?" Harold asked when I explained the situation to him. "Probably not," James replied. "I'm going to respond to this petition with a comprehensive filing that documents all of their unauthorized financial activities over the past several years. When the court sees what they've been doing, and when they realize that your decision to cut off financial support was actually a reasonable response to financial abuse, this petition is going to be dismissed quickly." James was right. But the process took 6 months of legal proceedings that were emotionally exhausting and financially expensive. We had to undergo psychological evaluations to prove our mental competency. We had to provide detailed financial records to demonstrate that our decisions were rational and well-considered. We had to testify about our children's behavior and provide evidence of their financial abuse. The most painful part was sitting in a courtroom and listening to my own children tell a judge that I was too confused and incompetent to manage my own money. Patricia took the witness stand and described me as a woman who had become paranoid and suspicious, unable to make sound financial decisions, in need of protection from my own poor judgment. Michael testified that my recent financial decisions were evidence of cognitive decline, that my refusal to continue supporting my children financially was proof that I no longer understood my obligations as a mother and a grandmother. Sarah cried on the witness stand as she described how my sudden personality changes had damaged our family relationships and left her children wondering why their grandmother had stopped loving them. It was a masterpiece of manipulation and emotional blackmail, but it was also a complete fabrication. And when James Morrison began presenting evidence of their actual behavior over the years, the tide turned quickly. He showed the court records of their unauthorized access to my financial accounts. He presented documentation of the forged signatures and fraudulent transactions. He played recordings of phone conversations where they had demanded money and threatened consequences if I didn't comply with their wishes. Most damaging of all, he revealed the original documents I'd found in Harold's desk, the emails and letters where they had discussed having me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't voluntarily surrender control of my finances. The judge was not impressed with my children's case. In his final ruling, he not only dismissed their petition but also ordered them to pay our legal expenses and issued a warning about filing frivolous guardianship claims against elderly relatives. "The evidence presented in this case," he said from the bench, "suggests that Mrs. Thompson's decision to restrict financial access was not the result of mental incapacity, but rather a reasonable response to systematic financial abuse by family members. The petitioners' attempt to use the guardianship system to override their mother's legitimate financial decisions is inappropriate and concerning. We won, but the victory felt hollow. Yes, Harold and I retained control of our assets and our lives. Yes, the legal system had recognized that we were victims of financial abuse rather than perpetrators of financial irresponsibility. But we had also been forced to go to war with our own children in a public forum, to air our family's dysfunction in front of strangers, to defend our sanity and our competence against accusations from the people who should have loved and protected us most. The day the case was dismissed, Harold and I went home to our empty brownstone and sat in our kitchen without saying a word for an hour. The house felt different now, not like a family home, but like a fortress that had successfully repelled an invasion by people who had once been welcome there. That evening, Robert called. He was the only one of our children who hadn't participated in the legal action against us, and his voice was heavy with shame and regret. "Mom, I want you to know that I never supported what Michael and Patricia and Sarah did. I thought it was wrong from the beginning." "Then why didn't you stop them?" I asked. "I tried. I told them they were making a mistake, that you and Dad had every right to make your own financial decisions. But they wouldn't listen. They were convinced that you were losing your mental capacity and that someone needed to step in." Robert's call was the first sign that maybe, possibly, one of our children might be salvageable. But it was too little, too late to repair the damage that had been done to our family. "Robert," I said, "I appreciate that you didn't support the legal action, but you also didn't warn us it was coming. You also didn't defend us publicly. You stood by and let your siblings attack us because it was easier than getting involved. I know, and I'm sorry. I should have done more." It was the most genuine apology I'd received from any of my children in decades, but it couldn't erase the fundamental truth that had been revealed over the past year. When forced to choose between respecting us and getting our money, 3 of our 4 children had chosen money without hesitation. The legal victory was the end of one battle, but it was also the beginning of a much larger war. The war for my own self-respect and dignity in the face of my children's ongoing manipulation and emotional abuse. They hadn't given up on getting control of our money. They just learned that they needed to be more sophisticated in their approach. But I had learned something too. I had learned that I was much stronger than I'd ever imagined, much more capable of defending myself than they'd assumed, and much less dependent on their approval than I'd believed. The little old lady they'd been laughing at was about to show them exactly how powerful a woman with nothing left to lose could be. The year following the court case was the strangest period of my entire life. For the first time in decades, Harold and I had complete control over our time, our money, and our decisions. We didn't have to field panicked phone calls about financial emergencies. We didn't have to evaluate requests for loans or gifts or business investments. We didn't have to navigate the complex emotional manipulation that had become our children's primary method of communication with us. We were free, but we were also alone. The silence was the hardest part. Our children had effectively cut us off from our grandchildren as punishment for cutting them off financially. Birthday cards went unacknowledged. Christmas presents were returned unopened. Even casual attempts to maintain contact were ignored or rebuffed. Patricia had convinced her teenage daughter that we were toxic grandparents who were trying to control the family through money. Michael told his sons that we had developed age-related mental problems that made us unpredictable and potentially dangerous. Sarah's children were told that we didn't love them anymore because we'd stopped helping their mother financially. The cruelty of turning our grandchildren against us was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire situation. These children had been innocent victims of their parents' financial greed, and now they were being used as weapons in the ongoing war over our money. But Harold and I made a conscious decision not to let our children's cruelty destroy what remained of our lives. We started traveling, something we'd always talked about but never done because there was always someone who needed our money more than we needed vacation experiences. We took that cruise to Alaska and marveled at glaciers and whales and landscapes that reminded us why we'd worked so hard to build a life together. We visited Italy and walked through museums filled with art that took our breath away. We spent 3 weeks in Ireland, exploring castles and countryside that felt like scenes from the fairy tales we'd read to our children decades earlier. Every trip reinforced the same realization. We had been living like prisoners in our own lives, constrained by our children's endless needs and demands, unable to enjoy the wealth we'd accumulated because every dollar we spent on ourselves was a dollar that couldn't be given to them. Now, for the first time in 40 years, we were living for ourselves, and it felt revolutionary. I also threw myself into my business with renewed energy and focus. Without the constant distraction of family financial drama, I was able to concentrate on expanding my textile company and exploring new markets. I hired additional staff, opened a larger warehouse, and began importing fabrics from suppliers in Asia and South America. The business grew by 40% in 18 months, generating more income than I'd ever imagined possible. Every month, I deposited profits that exceeded what I used to give my children in an entire year. Their financial demands, which had seemed so urgent and overwhelming when I was responding to them constantly, now seemed tiny compared to what I was earning independently. But the most significant change wasn't financial, it was psychological. I began to remember who I had been before I became defined primarily as my children's source of funding. I rediscovered interests and passions that had been buried under decades of caregiving and sacrifice. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since my 30s. I joined a book club and a gardening club and a women's investment group. I made new friends, people who knew nothing about my family drama, and who appreciated me for my own qualities rather than for what I could provide them financially. These relationships reminded me what it felt like to be valued as a person, rather than as a resource. Harold and I also began talking seriously about our legacy and what we wanted to do with our wealth. For years, we'd assumed that our money would eventually go to our children and grandchildren. Now, we began exploring other options. We increased our charitable giving significantly, supporting causes that aligned with our values rather than funding our children's lifestyle choices. We established scholarship funds, donated to medical research, and supported local community organizations that were making real differences in people's lives. The satisfaction of seeing our money used for genuinely productive purposes was profound. Instead of watching our wealth disappear into the bottomless pit of our children's financial irresponsibility, we were seeing it create positive change in the world. But perhaps most importantly, we began to understand that we didn't owe anyone access to our money simply because we were related to them. Family relationships should be based on love and respect, not on financial transactions. Our children had confused these concepts for so long that they'd lost sight of what a healthy family relationship actually looked like. 18 months after the court case, we received an unexpected visitor. Robert showed up at our door on a Thursday evening, looking haggard and defeated. "Mom, Dad," he said when we let him in, "I need to talk to you about something important." We sat in the living room where so many difficult conversations had taken place over the years, and Robert began to speak with more honesty and vulnerability than I'd heard from any of our children in decades. "I've been watching what's happened to our family over the past 2 years," he said, "and I've been thinking about my own role in all of this. About the way I treated you, the way I took your generosity for granted, the way I stood by while Michael and Patricia and Sarah tried to steal your money through that guardianship case." Harold and I listened without interrupting, sensing that this was different from the manipulation and emotional blackmail we'd become accustomed to. "The truth is," Robert continued, "I've been as guilty as anyone else of treating you like a bank rather than like my parents. I just want you to know that I understand that now, and I'm sorry." "What brought about this realization?" I asked carefully. "A few things. First, my own kids are getting older, and I've been thinking about what kind of relationship I want to have with them when they're adults. I don't want them to see me primarily as a source of money or support. I want them to love and respect me as a person." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Second, I've been struggling financially since you cut off support, and that's been hard. But it's also been educational. I've had to make different choices, live within my means, figure out how to solve my own problems without running to you for help. And you know what? I'm a better person now than I was when I could always count on you to bail me out." This was remarkable. For the first time in years, one of our children was acknowledging that our financial support might have been counterproductive, that it might have prevented him from developing the skills and character traits that come from handling one's own responsibilities. "Third," Robert said, "I've been watching how happy you and Dad seem now. You're traveling, you're involved in activities, you're making new friends. You seem lighter somehow, less burdened. And I realized that we weren't just taking your money all those years, we were taking your freedom and your joy." I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. This was the kind of insight and empathy I'd been hoping to hear from my children for decades. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Robert concluded, "and I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I understand what we did to you, and I'm genuinely sorry for my part in it." It was the most honest conversation I'd had with any of my children since they'd become adults. But it also raised difficult questions about forgiveness and reconciliation, and what, if anything, could be rebuilt from the wreckage of our family relationships. "Robert," I said slowly, "I appreciate your apology more than you know, but I need to understand something. Are your siblings aware that you're here? Do they support your decision to apologize to us?" Robert shook his head. "They don't know I'm here, and they wouldn't support it if they did. Michael and Patricia are still convinced that you're somehow mentally impaired, and that the court made a mistake in dismissing their guardianship petition. Sarah is still angry about the money and talks constantly about how unfairly you've treated us. And what do you think about their position? I think they're living in denial. I think they're so invested in seeing themselves as victims of your financial decisions that they can't acknowledge their own responsibility for what happened to our family." Robert's visit lasted 3 hours, and by the end of the evening, Harold and I felt cautiously optimistic that maybe one of our children was capable of growth and change. But we also understood that Robert's transformation didn't solve the larger problem of our fractured family dynamics. 3 children were still actively hostile toward us, still convinced that we owed them financial support, still looking for ways to gain control of our assets. One child had apologized and seemed genuinely remorseful, but he was also isolated from his siblings and unable to influence their behavior. The question we faced was whether one authentic relationship could justify the ongoing pain of 3 destructive ones. That question became urgent 6 months later, when Patricia showed up at our house with a proposal that would test everything we'd learned about our children's priorities and our own boundaries. It was a Saturday morning in October, and Harold and I were sitting on our front porch drinking coffee and reading the newspaper when Patricia's car pulled up to the curb. She walked up our front steps with a confidence I hadn't seen from her since the court case, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested this was a planned business presentation, rather than a spontaneous family visit. "Mom, Dad," she said, settling into a chair without being invited, "I have a proposition that I think will solve our family problems once and for all." I exchanged a glance with Harold. After 2 years of relative peace, we weren't eager to re-engage with Patricia's schemes and manipulations, but curiosity got the better of us. "What kind of proposition?" Harold asked cautiously. Patricia opened her portfolio and pulled out a set of professionally prepared documents. "I've been working with a team of financial planners and estate attorneys, and we've developed a comprehensive family wealth management strategy that addresses everyone's concerns and interests." She spread the documents across our porch table like she was conducting a board meeting, charts and graphs and legal language that was designed to look impressive and authoritative. "The basic concept is this," she began, launching into what was clearly a rehearsed presentation. "You and Dad maintain full control over your assets during your lifetimes, but you also establish irrevocable trust funds for each of your children and grandchildren. These trusts would be funded immediately with a portion of your current wealth, providing financial security for the next generation, while also reducing your estate tax liabilities." It was a sophisticated version of the same basic request she'd been making for years. "Give us access to your money, but wrap it in legal language that makes it sound like prudent financial planning rather than family extortion. The beauty of this approach," Patricia continued, "is that it addresses everyone's concerns. You maintain control and decision-making authority. We get financial security and predictability. The grandchildren benefit from educational funds and inheritance planning, and the whole family benefits from tax optimization and professional wealth management." She handed me a summary document that outlined the proposed trust distributions: $500,000 for each of the 4 children, $100,000 for each of the grandchildren, plus ongoing annual distributions based on investment returns. "This represents about 30% of your current assets," she explained, "which leaves you with more than enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your lives while also ensuring that your family's financial future is secure." The presentation was smooth and professional, but it was also fundamentally dishonest. Patricia was asking us to give up $2.4 million immediately, plus commit to ongoing annual payments, in exchange for vague promises about improved family relationships and tax benefits. "What's the catch, Patricia?" I asked bluntly. "There's no catch, Mom. This is a win-win solution that benefits everyone. And if we agree to this arrangement, our relationship with you and your siblings will improve. You'll stop treating us like we're mentally incompetent. You'll stop using our grandchildren as weapons against us. Of course. This whole conflict has been about financial insecurity and uncertainty. Once everyone knows where they stand financially, we can focus on rebuilding our family relationships." It was a lie, and we all knew it. The conflict hadn't been about financial insecurity. It had been about respect and boundaries, and the fundamental question of whether Harold and I deserved to be treated as people rather than as resources. "Patricia," Harold said quietly, "what happens if we say no to this proposal?" She hesitated for just a moment before responding, and that hesitation revealed everything we needed to know about her true intentions. "Well, obviously that would be disappointing, but it would also be problematic from a legal standpoint. The estate tax implications of not implementing proper generational wealth transfer strategies could be significant, and frankly, there could be renewed questions about your competency to make such complex financial decisions without professional guidance." There it was, the threat, wrapped in polite language but unmistakable in its intent. "Accept our proposal, or face another round of legal challenges and competency questions." "Get out," I said firmly. "Mom, I think you're misunderstanding. I understand perfectly. You're asking us to give you $2.5 million, and you're threatening us with legal action if we refuse. That's not a family financial planning session. That's extortion. Patricia gathered her documents with wounded dignity, claiming that we were being unreasonable and short-sighted. As she walked back to her car, she delivered one final threat disguised as concern. I hope you'll reconsider this decision, Mom, for your own sake as much as for the family's. That evening, Harold and I called Robert to tell him about Patricia's visit. His reaction was immediate and angry. She's lost her mind, he said. After everything that's happened, after the court case and the legal fees and the damage to family relationships, she's still focused on getting your money. Robert, I asked, are Michael and Sarah involved in this new plan? I don't know for sure, but I suspect they are. Patricia's been having a lot of phone conversations with them lately, and whenever I ask what they're discussing, she changes the subject. We asked Robert to find out what he could about his siblings' involvement in Patricia's latest scheme. What he discovered confirmed our worst fears about our children's priorities and their complete lack of respect for our autonomy. Michael had been consulting with an estate attorney about challenging our wills on the grounds that we weren't distributing our wealth fairly among our heirs. Sarah had been researching Adult Protective Services procedures for reporting financial elder abuse by elderly people against themselves. Patricia had been building a case that our refusal to implement reasonable estate planning strategies was evidence of diminished mental capacity that warranted court intervention. They were planning a coordinated legal assault designed to force us to distribute our wealth according to their preferences, rather than our own choices. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They still saw us as frail, confused elderly people who could be intimidated and manipulated through legal threats and emotional blackmail. They still didn't understand that we had spent 2 years building legal defenses and financial strategies that would protect us from exactly this kind of attack. Most importantly, they still didn't realize that their behavior had fundamentally changed how Harold and I thought about our legacy and our obligations to future generations. That night, we made a decision that would have shocked us 5 years earlier, but felt completely natural given everything we'd experienced. We decided to disinherit our children entirely. Working with James Morrison and a team of estate planning specialists, we restructured our wills and trust arrangements to leave our money to charitable organizations and educational institutions rather than to biological family members who had proven themselves incapable of handling wealth responsibly. The irony was perfect. Our children's aggressive pursuit of our money was going to cost them everything they thought they were entitled to inherit, but we weren't quite ready to reveal this decision. First, we wanted to give them one final opportunity to show us who they really were when faced with the ultimate test of character versus greed. The test came in the form of a family crisis that none of us had anticipated. Harold had a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 months after Patricia's extortion attempt. I found him collapsed in our kitchen, called 911, and spent the most terrifying day of my life sitting in a hospital waiting room while doctors worked to save my husband of 48 years. The heart attack was serious but not fatal. Harold would need surgery and a long recovery period, but the doctors were optimistic about his prognosis. However, the crisis forced us to confront our own mortality in a way we'd been avoiding for years. I called Robert first, and he was at the hospital within an hour, bringing flowers for his father and genuine concern for both of us. Over the next several days, he visited daily, helped with practical matters like coordinating with Harold's doctors and managing visitors, and provided emotional support without any agenda beyond wanting to help his parents through a difficult time. I called Michael, Patricia, and Sarah that same day, leaving voicemails with the basic information about Harold's condition and which hospital he was in. Their responses revealed everything about their priorities and their character. Michael called back 3 days later, claiming he'd been traveling for business and just received the message. He visited the hospital once, stayed for 15 minutes, and spent most of that time asking questions about Harold's prognosis and recovery timeline that seemed focused on understanding the potential impact on estate planning timelines rather than on genuine concern for his father's health. Patricia showed up at the hospital with legal documents, claiming she wanted to discuss contingency planning in case Harold's condition deteriorated. She suggested that this might be an appropriate time to implement the family trust arrangements she'd proposed, while we were all thinking clearly about mortality and legacy issues. Sarah sent a flower arrangement with a generic "get well soon" card, but never visited or called. When I tried to reach her to provide updates on Harold's condition, she responded with text messages asking whether this health crisis might change our financial planning priorities. The contrast between Robert's genuine care and concern and his siblings' continued focus on money was heartbreaking but also clarifying. Even in the face of a family medical emergency, 3 of our 4 children couldn't set aside their financial motivations long enough to simply be present for their injured father. Harold noticed the difference too. During his recovery, he told me he finally understood what I'd been seeing in our children's behavior for years. "They don't love us, Evelyn," he said sadly. "They love what they think we can give them. Even my heart attack is just another opportunity for them to pursue financial advantage." It was the most painful conversation of our marriage, but it was also the most honest. We were finally acknowledging what we'd both known but hadn't wanted to admit. We had raised children who were incapable of loving anyone more than they loved money. But Robert's behavior during Harold's recovery also gave us hope that maybe one of our children could be salvaged from the wreckage of our family relationships. 6 months later, when Harold was fully recovered and we'd had time to process everything we'd learned during his health crisis, we made a decision that would change our family forever. We decided it was time for our children to learn the full truth about our financial decisions and their inheritance prospects. The revelation came at Harold's 75th birthday party, an event we hosted at our house for the first time in 3 years. We'd invited all 4 children and their families, along with some close friends who had become our chosen family during the years of conflict with our biological children. The party was pleasant on the surface, with everyone making an effort to avoid the financial tensions that had dominated our family interactions for so long. The grandchildren played in our backyard once again, and for a few hours, it almost felt like old times. After dinner, I asked everyone to gather in the living room for what I announced would be an important family discussion. "Harold and I are getting older," I began, "and recent events have reminded us that we won't be around forever. We've made some decisions about our estate planning that we want to share with all of you." The room fell silent with anticipation. Michael, Patricia, and Sarah were clearly expecting us to announce some version of the wealth distribution they'd been pursuing for years. "First," I continued, "we want you to know that we've had our wills updated recently to reflect our current wishes about how our assets should be distributed after we're gone." Nods around the room. They thought this was going to be good news for them. "Second, we want you to understand that our decisions have been influenced by our experiences over the past few years, particularly the way some of you have treated us in connection with financial matters." The mood in the room shifted slightly. They were starting to realize this might not be the announcement they'd been hoping for. "Third, we want to be completely transparent about our reasoning, so there are no surprises or misunderstandings later." I paused, looking at each of my children in turn, these adults I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who had repaid that sacrifice with systematic financial exploitation and legal threats. "Harold and I have decided to leave our entire estate to charitable organizations and educational institutions, with the exception of a modest bequest to Robert in recognition of his genuine efforts to rebuild our relationship on terms of mutual respect, rather than financial expectation." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the shock registering on their faces as they processed what I'd just told them. "You're disinheriting us?" Patricia finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We're choosing to leave our money to organizations that will use it for productive purposes rather than to individuals who have demonstrated that they view wealth as an entitlement rather than as a responsibility." Michael's face turned red with anger. "You can't do this. You can't punish us financially because we had disagreements about money management." "We're not punishing you," Harold said calmly. "We're protecting our money from people who have proven themselves incapable of handling it responsibly." Sarah started crying, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and frustration. "This is insane. We're your children. We're your biological family. You can't just give away our inheritance to strangers." "It's not your inheritance," I replied firmly. "It's our money. We earned it, we saved it, we invested it, and we get to decide what happens to it after we're gone." Patricia immediately shifted into damage control mode, trying to negotiate a compromise. "Look, if this is about the legal challenges and the guardianship petition, we can talk about that. We made some mistakes, but this seems like an extreme overreaction. This isn't about mistakes, Patricia. This is about character. This is about the fundamental question of whether you see us as people deserving of respect or as resources to be managed and eventually inherited." Robert, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Mom, Dad, I appreciate that you're making an exception for me in your estate planning, but I want you to know that I don't expect anything from you financially. The relationship we've rebuilt over the past couple of years is more valuable to me than any inheritance could be." His words were exactly what I'd hoped to hear from any of my children for decades. They represented the kind of gratitude and perspective that makes generosity meaningful rather than exploitative. "Robert," I said, "that's exactly why we want to make sure you're taken care of. Not because you expect it, but because you don't." Michael, Patricia, and Sarah left that evening in various states of anger and disbelief, but they weren't finished fighting. Over the following months, they made several attempts to challenge our estate planning decisions, to convince us to reconsider our financial choices, and to find legal loopholes that might restore their inheritance expectations. But Harold and I had learned from their previous legal challenges. and our new estate planning documents were ironclad. Every attempt to contest our decisions was unsuccessful, and every lawyer they consulted told them the same thing. Competent adults have the absolute right to leave their money to anyone they choose, and disinheriting adult children is completely legal and enforceable. The most pathetic attempt at reconciliation came from Sarah, who showed up at our house on Christmas Eve with her children, hoping that the sight of our grandchildren would guilt us into changing our minds about their inheritance. "Mom," she said, pointing to her teenage son, "look at Jason. He's going to be applying to colleges in 2 years. How can you deprive your own grandson of the educational opportunities your money could provide?" It was emotional manipulation at its most calculated and cruel, using a child as a weapon against his grandparents' financial autonomy. "Sarah," I responded, "Jason's educational opportunities depend on his parents' ability to provide for him, not on his grandparents' obligation to fund his college expenses. You and your husband have good jobs and the ability to save for your son's education if you choose to prioritize that over other expenses." She left that day having accomplished the opposite of what she'd intended. Instead of making us feel guilty about our estate planning decisions, she'd confirmed that we'd made the right choice about protecting our wealth from people who viewed it as a solution to their own financial planning failures. The final chapter of our family saga began exactly 1 year after Harold's birthday party revelation, when Patricia showed up at our house with a formal apology, and what she claimed was a genuine desire to rebuild our relationship. "Mom, Dad," she said, sitting in the same living room where we'd announced our estate planning decisions, "I've spent the past year thinking about everything that's happened between us, and I realize I owe you a sincere apology." Harold and I listened skeptically. We'd heard promises of reform from Patricia before, always in connection with some scheme to regain access to our money. "I've been in therapy," she continued, "working on understanding why I became so focused on money and inheritance issues, instead of on having a genuine relationship with my parents." This was new. Patricia had never acknowledged that her behavior might require professional help to address. "What I've learned about myself is deeply uncomfortable," she said. "I've realized that somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as people and started seeing you as financial resources. I convinced myself that I was looking out for your interests and the family's interests, but the truth is that I was primarily looking out for my own interests." We'd heard similar admissions from Robert, but hearing them from Patricia was shocking. She'd always been the most manipulative and calculating of our children, the one least likely to engage in genuine self-reflection. "I'm not asking you to change your estate planning decisions," Patricia continued. "I understand that I've destroyed your trust, and I understand that there are consequences for my behavior that can't be undone." This was also new. Previous attempts at reconciliation had always been connected to requests for financial reconsideration. "I'm just asking for the opportunity to rebuild our relationship on different terms. Terms that aren't about money or inheritance or financial planning. Terms that are about me being your daughter and you being my parents." Harold and I exchanged glances. We'd both become expert at detecting manipulation and insincerity over the years, but Patricia's words and demeanor seemed genuinely different. "What does that look like practically?" I asked. "It means regular visits that aren't connected to financial requests. It means phone calls just to check on your health and happiness. It means including you in family events and holidays without any agenda beyond spending time together. It means treating you with the respect and dignity that parents deserve from their adult children." We talked for 3 hours that afternoon, longer than we'd talked with Patricia in years. By the end of the conversation, I felt cautiously optimistic that maybe she was capable of change. Maybe her therapy had actually helped her understand the damage she'd done to our family relationships. But I also knew that words were easy and behavior change was hard. The real test would come over months and years of consistent actions that demonstrated respect and love, rather than manipulation and greed. Over the following year, Patricia surprised us by doing exactly what she'd promised. She visited regularly without asking for money. She called just to chat about ordinary things like the weather and current events. She included us in family gatherings and treated us like honored guests rather than like potential sources of funding. Most importantly, she began developing a genuine relationship with us as people, rather than as financial resources. She asked about our travels and our hobbies and our opinions on topics that had nothing to do with money. She shared details about her own life and work and challenges that gave us insight into who she was as a person, beyond her role as our child. It was the kind of relationship I'd always hoped to have with my adult children, but had never experienced because their financial needs and expectations had dominated every interaction. Michael and Sarah, meanwhile, remained unchanged. They continued to treat us with barely concealed hostility and continued to look for ways to challenge our estate planning decisions. Their visits were infrequent and uncomfortable, focused primarily on maintaining minimal contact in case we changed our minds about their inheritance prospects. But Patricia's transformation gave us hope that meaningful family relationships were still possible, even after years of conflict and disappointment. It also reinforced our conviction that our estate planning decisions had been correct. By removing financial incentives from our family relationships, we'd created space for authentic connections to develop. Robert, meanwhile, had continued to be a consistent source of joy and support. He visited weekly, helped with household projects and medical appointments, and included us in his family's activities in ways that felt natural and welcome rather than obligatory. His children, our grandchildren, had grown comfortable with us again, seeing us as loving grandparents rather than as the toxic figures their cousins had been told we were. The final validation of our financial decisions came 18 months after Patricia's apology, when Harold had a minor stroke that required several weeks of rehabilitation. Both Robert and Patricia were immediately available to help with his care, coordinating medical appointments and providing emotional support without any discussion of financial implications or inheritance concerns. Michael and Sarah, by contrast, were notably absent during Harold's recovery. They sent flowers and cards but made no effort to visit or help with the practical challenges of caring for an elderly person recovering from a stroke. The difference in their responses confirmed everything we'd learned about our children's priorities over the years. The ones who had developed genuine relationships with us were present during difficult times because they loved us. The ones who had only maintained relationships for financial reasons were absent when there was nothing to be gained financially from their presence. Now, as I sit in my kitchen at age 74, looking back on the most turbulent decade of my life, I can see clearly how much we've all changed and grown. Harold and I have learned to value ourselves and our relationship above our children's approval or disapproval. We've learned that it's possible to love people without enabling their destructive behavior. We've learned that family relationships based on financial transactions aren't really family relationships at all. We've also learned that we're much stronger and more resourceful than we ever imagined. The quiet, elderly couple that our children tried to manipulate and control turned out to be formidable opponents when our dignity and autonomy were threatened. Most importantly, we've learned that it's never too late to change the dynamics of destructive relationships, even with family members. By setting boundaries and enforcing consequences, we've been able to salvage relationships with 2 of our 4 children while protecting ourselves from continued abuse by the other 2. Our wealth, meanwhile, continues to grow. The business I built while navigating family financial drama has become more successful than ever, generating more income than we can spend on ourselves. The investments we made while our children were focusing on their inheritance expectations have performed better than any of their sophisticated financial advisors predicted. The money they thought they were entitled to has multiplied far beyond what they could have imagined, and most of it will indeed go to charitable causes and educational institutions that will use it to make positive differences in the world. But here's the most important thing I've learned. The question was never really whether I could survive without them. The question was whether they could learn to love me for who I am, rather than for what I can give them. 2 of them have learned that lesson, and our relationships are stronger than they've ever been. 2 of them have not, and they've lost access, not just to my money, but to my love and respect as well. The laughter that night at dinner, when they said, "Let's see how she survives without us," turned out to be prophetic. I didn't just survive, I thrived. I discovered my own strength, reclaimed my own dignity, and built the life I wanted rather than the life they expected me to live. And in the end, that's the greatest gift I could have given myself. The knowledge that my worth isn't measured by what I can provide for other people, but by who I am and what I choose to do with my one precious life. As I finish writing this story, the sun is setting over Brooklyn, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that remind me of the sunsets Harold and I watched during our cruise to Alaska 5 years ago. Tomorrow, we're leaving for a month-long trip to Australia, something we've wanted to do for decades but could never afford when we were constantly supporting our children's financial emergencies. The house is quiet, except for the sound of Harold reading in his favorite chair and the occasional car passing on our street. It's the kind of peaceful evening I never thought I'd experience again after years of family chaos and financial drama. Robert will check on the house while we're gone, watering the plants and collecting the mail like the caring son he's chosen to become. Patricia will call to check on our travels, genuinely interested in our experiences, rather than calculating the cost of our vacation. Michael and Sarah will probably not even know we're gone until we return, and that's perfectly fine with me. I've learned that not every relationship can be saved, even family relationships, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is step back and let people experience the consequences of their choices. The brownstone that they once saw as their inheritance will continue to appreciate in value, but it will eventually be sold, and the proceeds donated to organizations that help other elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse by family members. The business that they never bothered to ask about will continue to generate profits that fund scholarships for young women who want to start their own companies. The investment accounts that they tried so hard to control will continue to grow and will eventually endow research programs at universities where future generations can learn about finance and business ethics. And Harold and I will continue to live these final decades of our lives on our own terms, surrounded by people who love us for who we are rather than for what we can provide them. If you've listened to this story all the way to the end, I want to ask you something. Have you ever experienced something similar, either as the parent dealing with financially exploitative adult children, or perhaps as someone who recognizes these patterns in your own relationships with elderly family members? The statistics on elder financial abuse are shocking, and much of it comes from family members who convince themselves they're acting in their elderly relatives' best interests while actually serving their own financial goals. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar family dynamics. And if this story has touched you or taught you something about family relationships, money, and dignity, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. When we share these difficult truths about family dysfunction and recovery, we create community for people who might otherwise feel isolated and alone in their struggles. Remember, it's never too late to reclaim your power and your dignity, no matter how long you've been accepting unacceptable treatment from the people who should love you most. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to open my heart and share the most painful and ultimately the most liberating experience of my life. And remember, sometimes the people who laugh at your vulnerability are the ones who have the most to lose when you finally find your strength.